Every day we see more tents under bridges, more families living out of cars. And while the problems seem insurmountable, the solutions are simpler than you think. We share the real stories and the real solutions of homelessness, what works, what doesn't, and how communities like ours can do better. I'm Baron King, and this is Give Me Shelter. Well, welcome back. We're so glad you are here. We have an exciting, interesting topic for you today. It's called the criminalization of homelessness, and we're going to be approaching this from a couple different angles. I felt like this would be a topic that everybody would benefit if I brought in an expert in this area, and so I happen to have one, my good friend and colleague, Lindsey Krinks, who is the co-founder and director of advocacy for an organization called Open Table Nashville. Welcome, Lindsey.
Thank you. It's so good to be with you.
So we've been talking about this subject for quite some time, and why don't we start by, if you would, talk a little bit about the organization that you're a part of, how it started, and how it's grown over the years.
Sure. So, one of the co-founders of Open Table Nashville, and we started in 2010 after the big historic flood we had here. I had been interested in homelessness all my life. I had seen family members of mine fall in and out of homelessness, in and out of institutionalization of various forms, but really came to Nashville to kind of get away from some of that. And then when I realized how widespread it was here in Tennessee, and how there were so many systemic factors that were not only causing it, but perpetuating it and worsening it. I got really interested in the issue and fell in with some homeless organizers and Charlie Strobel, who started Room in the Inn, and they kind of took me under their wing. So we started Open Table Nashville in 2010, and we are a homeless outreach and advocacy group that also provides community education about issues of homelessness. And we are on the ground in the encampments on the streets with people. We are helping folks get off the streets, and we're also helping to organize them and advocate for better outcomes. We have no interest in just doing the charity work. Our model really is the justice work that looks at changing systems rather than just perpetuating the need for our services. So yeah, we have a systemic focus, but we are on the ground and don't lose sight of the individual as well.
Well, that's great. And I'm glad you brought that up because we've been talking on this series about the difference between individual factors and systemic factors. And if we really want to make a nationwide change in this crisis of homelessness, it's going to have to be at that systemic level. And this topic today is going to dive right into that.
Yes.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about what your specific role is right now with the organization.
Yeah, so right now I've done every role under the sun. So nonprofit people out there, I see you. I've done our development, I've done our outreach, I've done our interim co-director, I've done all the roles. I am in love with my job right now, director of advocacy. I get to work with people in encampments. I get to work with statewide folks and doing a statewide coalition on homelessness called Housing for All Tennessee, which I encourage folks to look into. And I also get to work with regional and national leaders trying to look at some of the systemic issues with our laws and policies that keep people entrenched in these cycles rather than helping them get out of them. So, different days I'm working with different community groups or on the streets myself with our people or leading statewide campaigns. So, it just kind of looks different from day to day, but truly love the work that I do and the people I get to work with.
Great. So let's just jump right in. For people like you and I, we're very familiar with the phrase criminalization of homelessness. For the person that may not be familiar with that term, what would you describe what this is all about?
Yeah, so the phrase criminalization of homelessness refers to the laws that target folks who are unhoused with citations, fines, and arrests. And it's often for just existing in public spaces or acts of daily living, like or sleeping. And the problem with these laws is that instead of reducing crime, they're actually creating criminals because people are getting charges that stay with them on their backgrounds. Again, just for something like resting. So it's a really huge widespread problem, not only in Tennessee, but across the United States.
Yeah, and we're gonna unpack that a little bit more, the ramifications of this. But is this kind of a new thing, or what's the history over criminalization?
Yeah, so what we're seeing today is basically a new iteration of vagrancy laws that first emerged in England in the 1300s. And in those days, things like idleness were seen as like a threat to the social order and political economy. So if you were resting, you weren't working and producing, right? If you look at the Trump administration's recent notice of funding opportunities for federal grants, you'll see language of endemic vagrancy. So there's a very direct link to what has happened to what we're doing here in this country. But in the US, we actually saw the expansion of vagrancy laws after slavery ended. And this was in order to pick up formerly enslaved folks and re exploit their labor through the convict leasing system and forced labor in jails. So there's an economic tie to this. The more recent kind of quality of life ordinances from the early 2000s, which is really targeting business districts and emerging downtown areas for sleeping, resting, obstructing the passageway, and things like that. These are kind of an offspring of a philosophy known as broken windows policing. And this is really important to understand what's happening now. That philosophy really grew in popularity in the 1980s after housing was defunded and the social safety nets that supported people were completely slashed by the Reagan administration. And many researchers say that this was the decade that mass homelessness began in the United States, the 1980s. So, when all this economic turmoil is happening, people are popularizing this theory, broken windows policing. It essentially says the kind of, I don't know, mindset behind it is that when there are broken windows or visible reminders of disorder in a community, then crime will flourish. The misguided
Mm,
fix then, right, is to clean up the broken windows and make things look good again. So we're not addressing the underlying issues. We're just fixing, kind of cleaning up the symptoms. So when it comes to homelessness, the broken windows are the people themselves. We're not kind of looking at the root causes of homelessness, asking why homelessness is emerging. And we can talk who is about the think tanks who are pushing broken windows policing because they're tied to the think tanks that are pushing a new form of criminalization now, which was the Manhattan Institute then, still is, and is the Cicero Institute now. So these forms of criminalization are cruel and should be stopped.
yeah, and so that the history is very interesting, and it's disturbing at the same time. Um, so you mentioned the Cicero Institute, and I'm guessing that a very small minority of our listeners are familiar with that organization. Can you shed some light on who they are, what their goal is, and their approaches to this issue?
Yeah. So I first became aware of the Cicero Institute in 2021, but they're a think tank out of Austin, Texas, that was founded in 2016 by a tech billionaire. That tech billionaire, Joe Lonsdale, made his money, his fortune, by investing in private prisons and founding Palantir. And if you're not familiar with Palantir, that's a company that provides surveillance and has been incredibly criticized for their policies that criminalize people in poverty and Black and Brown communities across the United States. So, with the Cicero Institute, one of their former senior policy advisors, Judge Glock, recently started working with the Manhattan Institute. Manhattan Institute in the 1990s popularized broken windows policing and had it implemented in New York. And then that kind of approach, again, trying to see the person on the street corner and say, they're the problem. If that broken window, that broken person stays visible, then crime is going to happen. So we're going to remove that person out of sight, out of mind. And that's going to be the way we kind of approach urban crime. There's a
Right.
direct link between these groups. And you asked what their goals were. They say that their goals are to restore liberty and innovation in American governance, but the impact they're having is very far from liberatory, especially for disenfranchised communities. Um, Something you and I care about deeply, like attacked and destroyed public trust in evidence based practices, including housing first. And rather than housing folks through proven methods, they're advocating for intervention strategies like camping bans and voluntary commitment. Um, Moving funding, public funding from permanent supportive housing to government run encampments that are akin to detention centers or internment camps. So they're a very
and
dangerous group.
and and very similar to the for-profit prisons that he's already running.
Follow the money, y'all. Follow that
So it's like
money. Yeah.
so. And what's interesting, if you go to the Cicero Institute's website, what you'll find is it was a little surprising to me because they communicate to the people that go there from this place of it sounds like it's a place of sincerity, a place of care. They're saying, hey, the past policies in the past have failed, and we have the solutions that it's cruel and inhumane and dangerous to be on the street. So it's safer if you're spend the night in jail.
Yeah.
And when you read it without maybe doing any research or looking at it, you think, wow, these people really care about a host of issues. But when you dig a little deeper, what you see is they're behind a significant amount of legislation that is actually exacerbating the problem and treating people cruelly.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, they write dozens of pieces of local and state legislation that criminalize homelessness and hire lobbyists, they court lawmakers, and they write opinion pieces to sway public narratives. And they've been actually active in Tennessee's state legislature. So they've got two registered lobbyists for Tennessee who actively disseminate information to our elected officials and work with them on bills. Um,
Yeah, so they're not active in every state. They seem to be focusing primarily on red states, where I think they can get some traction. But then we're starting to see in purple and blue states a growing activity along those lines. What are some of the bills that have come through the Tennessee legislature that they have their fingerprints on?
so
Give some examples of
Sure. Yeah,
kind
let's
of some
go.
of the legislation they're
Right.
behind.
Let's take them down. So in 2021, some folks will be familiar with the Tennessee law that makes it a felony to sleep or camp on public property across the state. So in 2021, legislators from the Cookeville area and other surrounding areas brought a bill that would make it a felony to be on public property. And while Cicero didn't author that bill, we testified against that bill. We were actually able to defeat it that year in 2021 in committee. But the person who testified for it was none other than Cicero's Judge Glock. He came on a Zoom into the committee meeting, and we are like, who is this guy? Is he a judge? No, he's not a judge. People mistakenly give him a lot of authority because his name is Judge Glock. He's not a judge. But he testified for the bill and had these wild reasoning and answers that made it sound legitimate to put people in prison instead and give them a felony instead of making housing and shelter and resources available. So we defeated it. They came back and the lawmakers changed it and they were able to push it through the next year. But, in 2020, I think it was 2023, there was another Cicero bill. It may have been 2022, I'd have to go back and look. But there's another Cicero authored bill. This is one of their, carbon copy bills that they pass around to different states that would have taken away money, federal funds in Tennessee from permanent housing and put them toward government-sponsored camps for people and would have made it much easier to involuntarily commit folks on the streets with mental health issues, or even without mental health issues that couldn't care for themselves. So we were able to defeat that before it got to committee through working with some of our behavioral health folks in Tennessee. But you can see how harmful these things are. And in other states, they've actually penalized service providers who won't work with some of their like bills and with camping bans and stuff like that. They've jeopardized their funding. Um, so we're watching them very closely. And that's one of the reasons why we started a statewide coalition to address these issues because the opponents are much more resourced and organized than they were than we are. So we are organized now. Thank you, Cicero. We will keep fighting those bills.
Okay, some of the things you've just described, boy, I think I read those recently in a HUD NOFO that tried to get released. Why do those things look similar?
Y'all, so like Cicero has found a very comfortable seat in Trump's administration. And whether you're on the right or the left, you should care about this because issues of homelessness are human issues. Cicero was part of drafting Project 2025, which is essentially like this administration's policy handbook that had very concerning plans with homelessness that we're seeing being implemented today. They've also been very intimately connected with HUD officials, and we should be very concerned about this because what that means is that research, evidence based practices, trusted community voices from the ground are no longer driving our nation's response to homelessness. Private interests are. Need to say that again. Profit concerns for some are driving our nation's homelessness response. So what you're seeing in the NOFOs are incredibly misguided and are going to set us back and cost us a lot on the human side and the financial side when it comes to interventions around homelessness.
So I should have defined the term NOFO before we started talking about it. It's a notice of funding opportunity. So I'm sorry. So every year, every 2 years, opportunities to get grant funding come out. And so HUD does this every 2 years, and you get to see the plan, right? If you want to be part of this plan, here's how it works, and we'll give you money. My organization has been a recipient for HUD funding for nearly 20 years. However, we are no longer receiving HUD funding. We've exited out of the program. And when this most recent release came out, I told my team, I said, hey, we're going to pull this thing apart. We're going to take a look at it. Just because we left HUD funding last year doesn't mean we're going to stay out. We're going to see if we can use any of these funds ethically and effectively. And quite honestly, Lindsey, we looked over the whole thing and we couldn't find any way to use those resources in a way that did not create a higher level of risk for people experiencing homelessness. Some things like, you can do outreach work with this money, but you have to communicate with your local police department where the encampments are. And then a significant amount of money was shifted from housing people to requiring significant levels of treatment. 40 hours of therapy per week per person. And the government's not paying for that. So, as a therapist, I used to charge $200 an hour. And for most people, therapy is an unbudgeted expense. And you're going to say that people experiencing homelessness are going to be required to attend 40 hours. And there's no therapeutic evidence that amount of therapy per week could be beneficial. So it was just ridiculous. But so we've covered the landscape of where some of these things are coming from. I want to dig down a little bit more specific and granularly to talk about a couple examples of these laws. So as we've said, Tennessee has the harshest public camping bill on the books, so to speak. It's a felony, or you can be charged with a felony. The police department, the DA, still can charge you with a misdemeanor, but they can raise it to a felony. Can you talk about what you see as some of the problems with using this iron-fisted approach to addressing homelessness?
Yeah, so, like you said, just sleeping in Tennessee could cost you 6 years in prison, a $3,000 fine, and the loss of voting rights. This only beats you down, this kind of approach that people call the carrot or the stick, this is the stick. This just beats you down below the ground. You're already underground. This does nothing to give you a hand up or help you get out of your system. And there's nothing just about this criminal justice system that punishes people for their poverty, especially in an inequitable political economy like the United States, where, the very few at the top have most of the wealth, and most of us at the bottom have very little. So, putting someone in the criminal legal system, I can't even call it criminal justice system, right? For
Criminal
just,
injustice.
yeah, there's nothing just about it. Putting someone in the criminal legal system who's just trying to survive is a completely backward approach. With the legal system, you've got to keep up with court fines, fees, fines, court dates, and whatever charges you get follow you when you're trying to get employment or jobs. Homelessness is not a criminal issue, it's an economic issue, it's a social and public health issue. We should be using those kind of frameworks to approach homelessness. And instead, our lawmakers and our country leaders are also at the state and local levels are having this very misguided approach because they're being fed misinformation about what homelessness is and the people that are struggling the most in our cities. So, yeah, there are just lots of problems with this approach, right?
Yeah. So, what we're really talking about is, and I hate to boil things down to just two options because in my mind, very few things are that simple. But in this case, there's really two philosophies a- a- available to end homelessness. One is investing in supportive services and affordable housing, right? It's trying to fix the systemic problem. The other approach is, hey, let's just arrest these people and get them off the street. So it seems like there's two options. One is to help people and to build affordable housing, and then the other is lock them up. And the problem with the lock them up strategy, and this is what we've found, is when folks come to us needing housing assistance or trying to get them into some form of housing, we look at each individual. We do an individual assessment because we're trying to find out what are their strengths, what are their assets or abilities, what are their obstacles to housing, and oftentimes people that have had recurring bouts of homelessness, the big problem we see is a criminal uh, background history or an eviction history,
Mhm.
right? And so, uh, you know, let's say we have somebody that's struggling to get by and they're unsheltered, they're living off the street. They get arrested, they get charged, they end up, if it goes all the way through and they're convicted, they're going to do some criminal time. They're going to come out. That act has just made it 50 times harder for my team to be able to get them into housing. So it's very short-sighted, and in my mind, it exacerbates the problem, and just put somebody off the street for maybe a couple months, maybe a couple years, but they're coming right back.
They're coming right back. So, like, one of the stories that I like to tell is a story of my friend Alabama, who I worked with for years and years on the streets. Like, if you saw Alabama pushing his shopping cart down the road, he would be the stereotypical like person people think of when they think about homelessness. But he walked, he had completely rebuilt legs full of steel because he had been hit by a car, couldn't work, was disabled. So he'd hobble down the road on his in his cart, and he had over 100, almost 200. It was like over 190 actual citations and arrests with over 300 charges that were all quality of life, like obstructing the passageway, public intox. Well, sometimes he drank, but most of the time he just was so like disabled that he couldn't walk straight, and the police would just pick him up. He couldn't get I could not, as an outreach worker, get him into housing because I could never find him for our housing appointments and our ID appointments because he was always arrested. So I literally made him a t-shirt and I wrote with a Sharpie on it. On the front, I said, "Please do not arrest me." And on his back, it said, "My outreach worker is working on my housing." And that dude, Alabama, wore that shirt almost every day. And sometimes he still got arrested. And I was like, man, come on, no cops. But But listen, when we finally got him into housing, guess how many interactions he had with law enforcement? Absolutely zero. All those expenses that were put into jailing him, going through court, taking him in, booking him, all of that disappeared. And we only had the housing and a small supportive services piece that was basically just us checking up on him. He lived out the rest of his
Wow.
life in his own home, and he died on his own terms with his people around him. Like, that is the difference that we're talking about here in approach.
That's a fantastic story, and I think a very great example of what we're talking about. I have one that really happened, gosh, 2 or 3 months ago. Uh, we have a woman in her 50s. I'm going to call her Molly. She has struggled her whole life with intellectual disabilities, so she has some cognitive challenges. She's been homeless for a number of years and getting services from us, but she qualified for a housing voucher. And it took us a while to find a suitable unit for her, and she was working with our case managers. And it was down to, it was just going to be a couple weeks before she could get into an apartment. So we're really excited about this. And Molly was walking in downtown Chattanooga, and you know, a lot of these folks are on their feet all day long, and she needed a break. And so she sat down, she walked to the edge of the sidewalk, she sat down on the curb and put her feet onto the pavement, onto the roadway. Now, this is a 3-lane road, right? 2 lanes going either way, a turn lane in the middle. Plenty of room. A cruiser pulls up, arrests her, and she's charged with misdemeanor obstruction. We're going to get to that next part, that you know where I'm going with this, but misdemeanor obstruction. So she tells her case manager that she has to go to court because she was arrested. And what we realize is, if she gets convicted of this, she loses her voucher. So here's a situation where somebody is this close to getting into housing. And are you telling me the only way to fix this problem was to arrest her? You couldn't say, Molly, you're not going to be able to sit here. Can you move? I'm worried about you getting hit or something like that. So our case manager went to the court hearing with Molly to support her. Um, the DA, which we have quite a few, I think, fairly progressive lawyers in our community, and we're a little bit different than some of the other areas of Tennessee, got really angry at Molly and was yelling that this woman needed to be locked up. Um, the judge realized that Molly had somebody with her, and Molly was having some challenges communicating. So the case manager got a chance to share who she was and what was going on. So um, the judge asked the case manager to go back into chambers with him, and she explained the whole story and what's at risk and everything like that. The judge came back out and threw the case out. And so, thank goodness. I mean, Molly's housed today, but it was this close, and I don't know what good that's going to do. Now, um, there's a bill that you and I are familiar with that changes misdemeanor public obstruction to, guess what? A felony. Talk about that, if you would.
Yeah, so last legislative session, so last February, we saw a bill come up that would have made it a felony in the state of Tennessee to obstruct a passageway. And we were like, "Oh hell no. Y'all, our people have nothing, like nowhere to go, literally nowhere to go." So I talked to some of our statewide contacts, including yours truly, Barron, um, and and said, "Y'all, what are we going to do? They don't need to hear from these legislators. Don't need to hear from another Nashville person. They hear from us all the time. Would y'all testify?" So Barron and another one of our contacts from a rural area of East Tennessee testified against that bill and said, "This is how harmful it's going to be if it's all of a sudden a felony to obstruct a passageway." A passageway is an awning. It's the doorsteps. If you're trying to get out of the rain, it's a sidewalk if you're sitting down with your belongings to get a break. And while we weren't able to kill the bill, because the legislators were trying to target protesters at that point who obstructed passageway for protest, we weren't able to kill the bill, but they were able to amend it. so that none of the passageways that it primarily affect our people are at play in that law anymore. It's really just about the big roadways and the highways that they're concerned about protesters blocking. So, which is still a problem. Let me be clear. I block streets and protest sometimes. So let me be clear. But, that was a win. Sometimes we're working toward proactive wins at the state of Tennessee. We want proactive policies, and that's what our coalition statewide work is focusing on. But in the meantime, our focus is killing bad bills and amending them so that they're less bad in a kind of political environment like we're in Tennessee.
Yeah. Yeah, it's concerning. Like I said, we're a large state. We have a lot of different areas. We have 4 large cities, but most of our state is rural. And Chattanooga in the southeast is, like I said, fairly progressive. And so we haven't had anybody in Hamilton County charged with felony camping. But I know in other parts of the state they are. And so it makes it tricky when you're homeless and you have that legislation potentially hanging over your head. All right. Well, listen, thank you so much for being here with this episode. Lindsey and I are going to be talking more about this in part 2, but that's all the time we have for today. As always, if you have questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, or ideas that would help our show, we want to hear from you. So remember, that's info@chatfoundation.org, CHATT foundation.org. We're also going to remind you, if you want to learn more about Open Table Nashville, there's her information on the screen. Please check them out. They're a great organization. My opportunities to work side by side with them have been very personally meaningful. And in this next episode, part 2, we're going to be talking a little bit more about what the average person can do, because if we just stay silent, then things are handed to us. So, but anyway, thanks so much for joining. Thanks for listening to Give Me Shelter. If you made it this far in the episode, I invite you to share it with at least one person today, because change happens one conversation at a time. I'm Baron King. We'll see you next time.